My name is Stuart Clark. I work for Cisco DevNet, or the developer program. I don't want to turn this into a huge survey. Quick show of hands. Who's heard of Cisco DevNet? Who's a member of Cisco DevNet? Say again? Some people not admit to. Okay, so the Cisco DevNet, or developer program, is a business unit within Cisco which helps people learn about to become a developer, basically. And we produce content with all the different business units across Cisco, and it gives you the exposure and the chance to work with all the Cisco products within the developer side, whether that's data center, collaboration, open source software, security, my area, network automation, which is split into a couple of things such as enterprise and service provider, which is what I focus on. We work with, like I said, a lot of the different business units across Cisco, and we help produce all of their API documentation, and then we also produce a lot of the learning curve on that, which is done within Cisco DevNet. The learning tracks are backed up by sandboxes, so you don't have to have the piece of equipment to actually try something out anymore. You can just reserve a sandbox within our environment, and then you can do what you want with it. And you can reserve those for up to 7 days. At this point, we have 85 different sandboxes and nearly 1,000 different learning tracks to go through. So no matter where somebody is on their sort of developer journey and what they're interested in, we have a huge range of things. And I create all of those tracks and work with the different business units. So today, what I want to talk about is a couple of different things. Is viral utils, network simulation. You'll have all have heard of viral, but now we've just made viral just that little bit more better. And one, I'm going to talk about infrastructure of code and then how that relates to network simulation. The benefits of configuration management, recipes, manifests, and playbooks, and the tools now that, as a network engineer, I started to inherit a number of years ago, and I see more and more people doing today. And then a configuration with Ansible example right at the end. I was going to do a live demo today. Due to some constraints, I've not been able to do that, so I've put the screenshots up there. However, after this, any break, please come and find me. I can show you this live demo and how it works and show you some of the tools that we're using. So I spoke a little bit before about Viral Up, and like I said, you would have all tried Viral in the past and had to play around with it. What I found with Viral is it can be a little bit cumbersome when you're dragging and dropping different sort of network topologies into your environment. So we wanted to do something a little bit more cooler, and coming from a CLI and sort of background, do this instead. So we worked with a great engineering group, which was headed up by a gentleman called Kevin Corbin at Cisco, and we developed viral utils. If you're familiar with Vagrant and the way that you bring Vagrant environments up with a simple command Vagrant up, Viral Up works exactly the same way. You basically viral up your topology, and it brings the entire thing to life. And this is how we utilize and build the sandboxes within DevNet. This is really cool because not only can I bring these up in my own environment, I can bring these up on a remote server somewhere, and it means I can create, run demos, run tests, run automation things before I want to push this out to, say, a production network. So it works really well for me building and developing tools, but also works really nicely if you're building a CI/CD pipeline, where you can test it in a staging environment first. This, of course, you don't have the luxury of having a full stack of your network topology somewhere in a data center. You can get the code from that, the above link up there. The slides are available afterwards. You'll be able to copy and paste, and you can just download and install that. There's full support through the GitHub repo as well for that. So why Ansible for the network, and why am I going to talk a little about Ansible? We found when bringing people into network automation that Ansible is a really nice way to bring network engineers into network automation. We kind of pitch it as no real network experience, no network automation or programming experience really required. It's really popular in the community, lots of great examples, and as you know, it's written in Python, really simple to install and get started. And this is when I started moving out of the sort of becoming the finger-defined networking and constantly bashing away with a CLI on multiple devices, as we've all done. This is the first kind of tool that I went into. I didn't come from a Linux background or a programmable background, so Ansible to me was a really nice starting point. Once I'd gone into the sort of programmable side of network automation, I then started to look about how to make my Deployment's better within our site. We was in the process of building 35 new data centers, and things were just becoming higgledy-piggledy, and then we were getting template bleed, and people were having different copies of templates and SRE and different teams making requests across. Your templates just become out of whack all the time. So using infrastructure of code then is then storing that as machine-readable code and not actually storing it then as the running configuration. And then once we found that we moved to this infrastructure of code way and storing all of our files in machine-readable data, things started to become a little bit more smoother. So just a little background, which I'm sure you'll all know, are the differences of storing sort of network as code. Storing everything in Git, either GitLab or GitHub, whichever you prefer. And then storing that in machine-readable formats like JSON, YAML, XML, those type of things. We used to store everything in one of the business units that I was in SVN, and everything was copied from a rancid server over to the SVN folder. But nobody ever really updated the SVN sort of side of it. And like I was saying, when we stood up a new site, that new site was completely different to the rest of the production sites that we had out there. Further on from this, on the next stage is then treating that as an actual source of truth. I found it really unreliable to keep relying on different people in the team just to say to them, hey, how did you configure this? And I needed a way to test and develop and deploy from the same source. Working with multiple teams across the board who want access to the network nowadays, like SRE and MonOps and DevOps and PlatOps, who want to add their own ACL rules and things to load balancers, firewalls, routers, etc. Being able to give them access to this and be able to get them to start to make changes themselves, then it's come to the review for the network team. It all then comes from the same source. We did find that the network team pushing things out from all the requests and constant change often fell out from the QA team as well. So after standing up a new site, the QA team will come back to us and say, these lines are missing from us. And sometimes when you're deploying a Cisco ASA with multiple contexts and you've got 2,000 lines of ACLs, it's really, really easy to have something that is different from the rest. And working in a secure business unit or the Cisco security business unit, certainly these are the things that need to be checked before the site goes into deployment and live, before customers can start use it. So I mentioned a little bit before about the sort of like the hand-to-hand combat, and this will be very familiar to all of us. I spent a lot of time doing hand-to-hand combat troubleshooting stuff when changes are made without RFCs or changes have come through and it's been pushed down by the project managers to get something delivered and somebody makes an unauthorized change. And then you get woken at 3 in the morning or some unreasonable time on the weekend when you're trying to enjoy playing some Lego or go to Starbucks, that you get called and you're trying to figure out what's gone wrong. It's quite easy then to go back to your source control and then identify running a diff on what you've got on your production and then what you've got in your source control as to what's actually changed across your network. So the configuration management, as I mentioned there, is just all about the tools. And this was, again, something that I came across as relying on other teams within the business unit to actually help us provide the tools. We started to adopt a lot more stronger DevOps and NetDevOps thing where if we built it, we owned it. And then we started to take control of those tools. That's not my cat, by the way, if anybody asks. I have put in cats in PCs. Not anymore. So looking at characteristics and desired state, software and versions installed. As I was mentioning before that we was in the Cisco security business unit. You get a Cisco architect will come to you and they'll have a message from PCERT or CCERT to say that there's a bug on some code. I've got 2,000 ASA out there. We're in the middle of doing a hardware upgrade and a software upgrade at the same time. Being able to run automation against that entire network to actually see if we're running vulnerable code becomes very important, especially when the turnaround to get that kind of information is a matter of hours rather than days. And then being able to run system attributes and names, ownership and that kind of stuff against it. The running automation against your network stack all of a sudden becomes a lot more easy to find the owners of said devices and what's going on. And feature-specific configuration. And what I mean by that is that sometimes when you're in a multi-tenant environment, you have a little bit of a grey area or a dark area of the network that's been stood up for a particular tenant. It's nicely documented, but you want to know a little bit more about it. Being able to pull that desired state back from there and find out, it becomes a lot simpler and quicker. Benefits of configuration management. We used to send data center teams to sites. And they were given 5 days to stand up on it, something like 6 cages. They would land on the site, say, on a Monday, and they were flying out there on a Friday night. One particular incident comes to mind where we flew a bunch of stuff into Secaucus, and half of it got held back in customs. So the data center team got on and built what they could, but by day 3, the other half of the stuff was still sat in customs somewhere in Secaucus with no ETA on arrival. The data center team are scheduled to fly out of Secaucus to go across to San Jose to carry on with the next build. Unfortunately, that stuff is still lost. No one knows where it is. In the olden days, the data center team used to stand everything up, put the management address on it, and then we'd sort of copy and paste a bunch of text files into that, which is okay, but it's not the best way to deploy hardware or software service for sure. So we started using the automation to actually do this and push it out, the whole config out to the device. Using that source control that I mentioned before to actually control and push everything to the devices, it made it a lot more quicker for the data center team. And in the end, we cut their time on site down from 5 days to 3 days, which pleases people greatly. And this is my favorite one when I start to talk about snowflakes. Often I was called as being an on-call engineer in the middle of the night. It's 2 a.m. I have somebody screaming down the phone at me, wanting something to change. It's either customer impacting issue or it's a business facing issue. So you kind of struggle out of bed if, like me, you wear glasses, contact lenses. You trip over the dog. You find your way to your sort of office and stuff like that, and you sit like Moley. Do you remember Moley? 2 inches away from the screen kind of thing, you know, buried your head right into it. Sat there at some unruly hour, look into it. You put the quick fix in to get this to work for whoever's the team is requesting it, and then you go back to bed. You wake up the next day, dog's limping around. You're out the door really quickly. How many times have you all walked into the office and then pretty much it's like a nuclear explosion's gone off, something again has inevitably happened. And instead of looking back to what you deployed the night before, you jump in with the rest of your colleagues in the business to actually sort out the issue. Soon enough, that day turns into night. You can maybe work through the night, and all of a sudden you've got this snowflake in your network, and then 3 weeks later you end up scratching your head thinking, how did that get in there? And that's those kind of little magic fixes that we tend to put in the network just to get something working, but that kind of differs itself away from our existing template and what we should actually have. So no more snowflakes. Which then goes down to the kind of the version control and all organic configurations. And I talked a lot about having things in source control and version control. As we began to sort of push changes out to the network, we used to do it in incremental stages where we'd have the SRE team could log tickets quicker than we could actually resolve them. And then you've got a whole bunch of other teams logging tickets for access and things like that, and especially if you've got a lot of ACLs within your environment, certainly. So we wanted to push the changes out sort of incrementally across the network instead. So we used to have a change, and we always did no change Fridays. Nice rule to have. And we pushed the changes out across on usually a Wednesday or a Thursday as a rule before we started pushing them out a lot more incrementally. But then when we started using source control and our automation proved really fruitful, we was able to push changes out a lot quicker. But say I've got 10 changes sat in my queue, all for the same team, mostly access lists. Do I push these out in one go, or do I push them out incrementally? I preferred the incremental sort of changes and pushing them out individually. It made it a lot easier then when running your automation test to make sure that something was working afterwards, able to identify if something was breaking. So you'd have pretty much everything all ready to go in your version control. You would push change 1, test it, push change 2, test it, and 3 and 4 and so on across the board. So some of the commonalities of management tools. When my old business unit started on an automation thing, we looked at a whole bunch of different things to do our automation. And I mentioned a little bit before that we started with Ansible because at the end of the day, we were network engineers with no programming skills. We spoke to the SRE manager who had some really great talented people who were doing the Chef, Puppet and Salt stack across their network. But for us, this didn't suit us at the time. But some of the things when we started to look at them as to why some of the things that we wanted to use, these are the kind of main 4 that we did look at, were that they were open source foundation, they had automation and orchestration. I always struggle with this word when I'm dry in the mouth. idempotent behavior. I think it's law actually now when you're speaking about automation to talk about idempotency. I'm not sure, it has to be in a slide somewhere. So idempotent behavior, and then again, as we mentioned, lots of facts and things like that. I like the idea of having idempotency within the network. We did come across some different caveats with using different tooling around that behavior, as you know, when using those things of idempotency within a network device. And all the various modules and libraries which are fully supported with all of these products that I've talked about. So when going into the leadership meeting, we brought up a slide here and said these are the things that we're looking at, and this is our troubleshooting list of things and the products that basically we're using here. And we'd looked at Puppet, and we'd looked at Chef, and we'd looked at SaltStack, and we'd looked at all the different variations. And with all automation, your mileage may vary. What suits my business unit and my network might not suit yours. And this is a commonly asked question: is there a blueprint that we could start to push out? There is of sorts, but it also depends on your skill set and your network and what you're running. And for us at the time, running Ansible and running that from a centralized location became the best option for us. We actually did move on a little bit from this since I recreated this slide. We moved on to using Python libraries and using things like Napalm, Nori, and also PyATS for validation and checking. If you ever get the chance to look at PyATS, I strongly do. It's a really nice Python library which is great for validation and checking of your deployments. Also, Nori is fantastic if you've come across that one as well. I'm doing a lot of work with Nori at the minute. So, running Ansible, we had the Ansible Playbooks, and we was able to run roles against different groups and things, so we could run stuff against the core devices, the core routers, the edge routers, and that kind of stuff, and we could actually run them against different versions of that. We had a mixture of 9001s, 9006s, and 9010s with just different port layouts and things, and they played different roles within our environment. So we was able to run Ansible Playbooks against those, and you can do that with the limit command. We then had an inventory file which listed out all our devices, which we found kind of kept growing and growing and growing and growing, and then the different variable files that I spoke of. When you have different products like 5Ks and 7Ks and 9Ks, and you have different port layouts and things like that, the different devices that you want to deploy against, you can then specify what you want to choose against. So imagine, if you will, this is my data center that my data center team has flown to the site for. They've cabled everything up. They've given me network access on a management layer now, and I can get into the devices, but there's no other things configured there. And this represents pretty much a standard deployment, which I would have done out in the network. So you've got sort of 2 edge devices, 2 core switches, and then say an access or a top of rack device there. So then what I would do is I would want this as the final end configuration. I would want layer 3 linked between the core and distribution layers, OSPF, VPC, layer 2, you're all familiar with, and VLANs configured with SVRs and HSRP, etc. And I wanted to push all of this out in one go. So then what I would do is I would bring this up as a separate as a viral topology file to test the latest deployment that I'm going to push this out, and I would do this, as I mentioned, with viral up. And there's a little screenshot in there of the viral util tool that I was talking a little bit about and some of the features that you can do there. If you don't specify the viral name, which is quite important, it will actually just take the default one. To see the simulations that you're running on your device, you can just use viral ls-all, and you can see the simulations. And if you want to check the state, you can use viral nodes, which will display IP addresses and state. Once the nodes are available, in this circumstance when I was using Ansible, although there is support for NSO and PyATS in the just the downloadable version with no configuration needed, this will create a default file for you to save the work for doing this. And if you ever get stuck, you can use the viral help. But there's a lot of other things within the viral util tool there, which are really helpful. Just the quick ones are viral down, which will basically destroy the environment, viral ID, viral logs. The nodes, which we talked about, pull will actually pull it from the latest repo, so if there's any new topologies there, you can always get that SSH telnet, that kind of stuff, start and stop to actually get to your boxes, which is really useful. And so what I would do is I would deploy pretty much everything into the simulator before then pushing it out into a production environment. With viral utils, just a couple of things you need to be aware of. Robust support for large topologies and mimicking production. I've scaled this out to, I think, 20 nodes on a UCS blade at one point. My actual own Mac, I think I've had nearly 8 devices running on that before it started to complain at me. There's a full data plane within the simulation to test traffic flows and protocol behavior, and an offload simulation to a remote server. So you can just basically offload the traffic within the Viral Utils tool as well. But there are some caveats as well for typical use. Don't use it on a fully local dev environment. Yeah, I did try to bring up 20 XR routers, some 9,000 V Sandstones on my Mac, and that's why I've now got a replacement. Typical significant time to instantiate networks and things like that. Bringing this up, it doesn't come up as really, really quickly, as you know, with all network simulations and dev environments, those kind of things. It does take 5 or 6 minutes to come up. And not an insignificant resource required for large topologies. So, like I said, I think I can get about 8 to 10 nodes running on my local environment, but I would strongly suggest if you wanted to go any further with Viral Utils, use a server for it. I know I've gone through this really quickly, sorry. So what did we cover here? I covered a little bit of the infrastructure as code and what configuration management means these days, the benefits of configuration management, the recipes, manifest, playbooks, and some of the tools that I've been using to actually stand up both virtual environments and production environments. And then we saw a little bit of the idea of what we've configured with Ansible just at the end. I think I'm good for time. What to do next, there's a whole bunch of resources on there. You'll be able to click on any of these links on the slide when you download it. There's a whole bunch of the introduction there. The entire topology is actually there. It's listed under using Ansible with NXO devices and in the introduction to ACI with Ansible. That's all there, the topology that I spoke about, and you can basically bring that entire topology up and play with it as you will. Like I said, destroy it, do what you want with it. It's yours. You can share it, and then just some resources on the side of Ansible, Chef Puppet. And that brings me to a close of my slides. There's a lovely little picture of me there in Barcelona. All my contact details are up on there, my Git repo, everything for DevNet. We're a very, very open community. If you have any questions with things like APIs or anything to do with automation at Cisco, we can certainly connect you into the various teams within the Cisco engineering to help you out with any of those problems that you're facing. Feel free to hit me up on all of the mediums. Any quick questions?
Does anybody have any questions for Stuart?
One at the back.
Right at the back.
So most stuff you're talking about is about managing configuration and configuration files and adding, modifications in the middle of files. Is there any notion of a meta layer above that where you can describe end-to-end services mapped down into the configuration files?
It's certainly not one that I did in a production network at all. I know there is certain things out there, certain tools out there, NSO, EPNM and stuff like that will actually be able to handle that for you, but it's not something I've done certainly within the production environment. Pretty much the way that we would run our workflow is that a change would come in. The change would be an engineer would make a branch of the master. They'd make the required changes. That would go up to be merged. It would be reviewed. Once it had been merged into the master, it would get pushed into the staging environment. If everything passed in the staging environment, then it would move over into the production, and that would be pretty much the typical workflow.
And just another question: in your staging environments, is the staging a matter of pushing configs to make sure that they stick, or are there any end-to-end tests that you run through the staging environment?
Yeah, through the staging environment, we had different tests. We've done things like load. If it was anything to do with load, we had Spirent testing or something like that, running load against services if we were bringing up new services, or monitoring throughput, how the throughput would actually have impact on the firewalls. A lot of the firewalls that I was using, we were running them really, really hot. We were exceeding the traffic flows. I think the 55 ASP SSP 60 will allegedly do something like 22 gigs RX, and we were running them at close to 28. Which is probably not recommended. They were running them at sort of 80% across the road. So we were doing low throughput tests. For configuration tests and validation, we used Jenkins for that in the early days, and then further on we've moved into sort of PyATS to test the configuration changes. The important bit about a lot of the deployment with the automation is having the ability, if something does break and go sort of sideways, is being able to roll that back. One of the main caveats we come across when going into the automation side was something would get deployed, and as you know, with automation, you can destroy your network a whole lot quicker than you can manually. been there. Hey, boss, great news. Oh, sorry, bad news. I brought the network down. Good news is I did it with automation. Yeah, he didn't like that one bit. We don't speak anymore. Any more questions?
Well, if there are no more questions, I'd like you all to join me in thanking Stuart.
Thank you all for having me.